Welcome back to God Has a Name. We are getting back into a series that basically is based around the Bible, of course, but this little book, God Has a Name, by a guy named John Mark Comer. He's a pastor out in Portland, Oregon. If you haven't picked up a copy of this book, we would encourage you. Pick up a copy. It's a great little book. Has a lot of great information in it, and we're kind of going through that as we go through this series. Basically, the book revolves around God's self-disclosure of himself, and it is in Exodus chapter 34, verses 5 to 7. It is the most quoted passage in the Bible by the Bible of what God is saying about himself. And here's what it says: Yahweh, Yahweh, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands, and forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin. Yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished. He punishes the children and their children for the sin of the parents to the third and fourth generation. So in the first week of this series, we talked about the fact that God has a name and that he revealed that name to Moses. It's this name Yahweh. It basically means he is. He is this timeless, self-existent one. Names, of course, in Hebrew culture are much more than just a title or a label. They describe the character of someone and even their destiny, their essence. And so this idea of God having a name, that God would reveal that to Moses, is very powerful. Last week we talked about the fact that Yahweh is God, but he is God among the gods, that there are actually many gods that are mentioned in the Bible, spiritual forces that are at work in the world. We learned that they work in regions, that they work through specific avenues. I believe that they are at work all of the time in the different sort of areas of life, whether it's media, education, government, entertainment, that these gods of the world are at work. And it's naive of us to think that they are not at work in the world. Even the idols that we latch onto, I believe, have spiritual powers behind them, and we've kind of seen that as we've gone through this series. Everyone worships, but we need to be careful that we're worshiping the right one, the right God, and so that's what we talked about last week. Now today we're going to get into the description that Yahweh starts to paint of himself. And it's a very powerful description. And basically he's talking today about the fact that he is compassionate and gracious. And so our title today is Compassionate and Gracious. God's baseline emotion toward you is mercy. We're going to talk about this. Imagine, if you can, living in the ancient Near East around 1500 BC. You say, I'm having a hard time with that. Yeah, perhaps. Think about this. You're a Hebrew. You're formerly a slave of Egypt, and now you're traipsing through the desert somewhere in the Sinai Peninsula. Your world is full of gods and goddesses. This is just the way that people lived back then. You had come out of Egypt. You had known all kinds of different deities, powerful spirit beings who are anything but nice. I mean, read any ancient text, and you will find out that the gods of those days were not nice. You learn to make sacrifices. You maybe begin by sacrificing a bird, sacrificing animals, but as you become more sort of connected to these gods and as they demand more and more from your life, you may start even sacrificing more, maybe even your own children. This is the kind of thing that we see in the Bible all of the time in these ancient cultures. Ancient stories include details like this. Only a few hundred years after this time, we see the tale of Agamemnon, when the goddess Artemis is angry at Agamemnon during the Trojan Wars. She actually demands a sacrifice of Agamemnon. She demands that he sacrifice his daughter to her. And again, these are myths and legends, but they're based on something, and they're very barbaric. But in ancient cultures, this was not uncommon. In fact, if you go back in 2 Kings chapter 3, you would see that the king of Moab, when he was losing a battle, actually offered his son as a sacrifice to the gods upon a wall. He kills his own son to appease the gods so that he might win a battle. So to live in the ancient Near East was to live in constant fear of the gods. There was no question for these cultures that these gods existed. But then along comes this Yahweh, the one that reveals himself as the one true creator God. He comes to your rescue. He saves you out of Egypt. He leads you through the Red Sea after performing all of these amazing signs and wonders. He gives you food and water to sustain you in the desert, and you have done nothing to deserve any of this from this God. So you have to imagine, if you put yourself in the sandals of someone 1500 BC, one of these Hebrew rescued slaves, that they're thinking, who is this God? He's so different from any God that I have known before. He's nothing like Artemis. He's nothing like Amun-Ra, nothing like Marduk or Molech. Who is this God? He seems to want a relationship with us. He seems to be reaching out to us in kindness. He tells us his name, and the first thing he tells you about himself after he reveals his name is that he is compassionate and gracious. Compassionate and gracious. All right, let's break it down like we have been. Let's talk about the Hebrew a little bit. If we're going to understand this context, we have to, get back there into the Hebrew. And in Hebrew, the order of things matters. The fact that this is the first thing that God says about himself, that he is compassionate and gracious, is very significant because very often in Hebrew literature, the thing that is mentioned first is given extra significance. And so in Hebrew, compassionate and gracious, let's put the words up there for you. It's Rahum wa Hanun. Rahum wa Hanun. Let's try to say it together. You don't need the gutturals. Just try saying Rahum wa Hanun. Can you do that? Let's say it together. Rahum wa Hanun. Pretty good. Pretty good. All right. So, of course, in Hebrew, we're reading this way. Wa, it just means the. Or and, rather. It just means and. So it's compassionate and gracious. And is connected to the word in Hebrew. But these two words are often paired together in Hebrew texts. And as you go through, they're often paired together. And you can kind of see why, because, Rahum wa Hanun, it has a little rhyme to it, right? It kind of rings. It's like other expressions that we have in English. It would be like, it would roll off the tongue, sort of like saying slip and slide, or thick and thin, huff and puff, right? It's got a little bit of a rhyme to it that makes it go together well. And so this is a term that often is seen with that specific wording. Now, they're closely related concepts, kind of like slip and slide, right? There's very fine nuances between the two words, but there is some difference. Sometimes the two words are actually translated the same, but let's take some time and pull them apart and try to understand what they mean. Rahum, which is this one here, actually comes from the word that means womb in Hebrew. The base word is the word womb. And linguists assume that there's a connection between the attitude of a mother and her infant child and that idea of compassion. Do you see the connection here? A mother, right? What stronger connection can we think of in terms of compassion than a mother with her own child that she bears from her womb? And so this becomes the word for compassion. It's very interesting, language is. When you see this word in certain contexts in Hebrew, it's actually impossible not to think about the root word from which it comes. It's as if the word in English for compassionate should be wombly. Imagine if in English the word for compassion was wombly, right? He's very wombly, compassionate, right? That's how it would sound in Hebrew. And so think about this. In 1 Kings chapter 3, we see King Solomon, this wise king, and as he's, becoming this very famous king for all of his wise deliberation, people bring their problems before him and he solves them. And at one instance, there are two women that come in, both bearing claim to this child, both of them saying, "It's my child. Deliberate." And Solomon's like, "Oh, great." He knows that obviously one of them's telling the truth and one is not. And so what does Solomon do? If you know the story, he says, "Okay, here's what we're going to do. This seems like an unsolvable situation." They didn't have DNA tests back then. He says, "Bring me my sword. We're just going to cut this little baby in two and give you each half." Right? Now you can imagine any woman that truly had compassion for this child, that truly bore this child, and this is what Solomon is thinking, is not going to let that happen. And sure enough, the true mother offers the child to the other, by which Solomon knows who the true mother is. And in 1 Kings 3:26, it says, the woman whose son was alive was deeply moved out of love for her son and said to the king, please, my lord, give her the living baby. Don't kill him. Now, the language in there is very significant. Was deeply moved out of love is sometimes translated yearned with compassion. And that word compassion is the same word that we're seeing here in Exodus 34. And so in this story about the fruit of the womb, this child, to see a phrase that sounds like was moved with wombliness, in Hebrew, you would not be able to miss that. You would catch it. She was moved with wombliness. This visceral connection of a mother to a child, it was powerful. Compassion. In Isaiah 49, Yahweh says this, can a mother forget the baby at her breast and have no compassion on the child that she has born? Though she may forget, I will not forget you. And again, this word compassion shows up. So there's a powerful emotion being conveyed here, a very motherly one. Now I want you to remember, God is neither male nor female. He is spirit. But we are created in his image. It says in Genesis 1:26, male and female, he created them. And so male and female both reflect the true image of God. And what we're seeing here is that this motherly compassion is a huge attribute of God. I think it's a shame today that so many women are taught that being compassionate is not a strong characteristic. It is such a powerful characteristic. It is so godly. It so reflects who God is. To be a compassionate person is a magnificent, powerful attribute. Women tend to be more compassionate toward children than men. It's a fact. You can say it's a stereotype, but stereotypes come from somewhere. And this is often true. Most of you who are in a committed relationship could say, yeah, my wife or, the woman of the relationship is just more compassionate toward the kids. I am sure that my children are thankful to have a mom who is as compassionate as she is. Because I can tell you, I don't have it in spades. I often lack it, right? My natural reaction to things is to solve the issue as quickly as possible, and I don't mind being harsh about it, right? But moms are compassionate, right? They're feeling what they're feeling, and it's very, very godly, apparently. Now, dads have compassion too. In Psalm 103, it says, the Lord, again, that's Yahweh, is compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in love. I put a little asterisk there. Do you know why? Where is it quoting from? It's quoting from Exodus 34. This is the most quoted passage in the Bible by the Bible. So there you're seeing it again in Psalm 103. As a father has compassion on his children, so Yahweh has compassion on those who fear him. And so fathers also have this compassion. May be different from that of a mother, but it's a parent-like emotion. Now, tragically, many of you listening today can't connect with the kind of love and compassion that I'm talking about here. And it's very unfortunate. Your family history is so warped that you can't properly conceive of a truly compassionate parent. And for someone that has had compassionate parents, I find that mind-boggling. I didn't have perfect parents, but I certainly felt compassion. But I know that there are a lot of people that have never really felt true compassion from their parents. Your dad was a manipulating alcoholic. Everything he did, it seemed like it was just to get something, to get around his issues. Your mom was a nagging perfectionist. You were never good enough. You were never smart enough. You were never athletic enough. You were never pretty enough. You were never enough of anything. What a shame. But I know so many people. I meet a lot of people in my work, and I know that many of you, even here today, that are listening, that's been your experience. My wife and I are blown away sometimes to see other families, to see them interact, to hear the vicious words. You effing this. And just the way they run one another down, just destroying who they are as people. We just shake our heads and say, what? You can't take those words back. What are you saying? This is your flesh and blood. So destructive. So if this idea of Yahweh, the compassionate and gracious God, fails to connect with you, I get it. But you need to understand that your experience, although common, was not normal. You understand the difference between common and normal? Common is what happens and with what regularity. And it's very common, but it's not normal. It's not the way it was intended to be. You need to come to understand the power of a parent's love. And maybe that will never happen until you yourself have kids someday. I don't know. I don't know what it takes to necessarily undo that, for you to grasp that proper perspective. But I can tell you, I sure experienced it when I had kids. You know, there's no way of predicting when you have children how it's going to change you. It's just, it blows you away. From the moment that that little child comes out, or the moment that that child is brought into your family, you're just like, wow, everything changes. It takes a very selfish person and can transform them into a very unselfish person very quickly. It can make somebody who really had very little compassion all of a sudden come alive with compassion and care and concern. It's crazy. It's greater than the love of a man for a woman, a soldier for their country, a sports fan for their team. It is the most powerful kind of love that exists in our universe, that of a parent to a child. It's crazy. We would lay our lives down for them. And here's the thing, guys, get this. This is how Yahweh, the Creator God, feels about you. That's how He feels about you. So this rahum, compassionate, this is a feeling word. It is a word that describes what's going on in the heart of God Himself when He thinks about you. He is compassionate. This is His default feeling and position toward you. So when you see this word being used, think about that. It's a feeling word. Now the word that goes with it, which is hanun, is the word gracious or merciful. The wa, of course, is just the and, but here we have the word hanun, and this is more the idea of being gracious, and this word is a little different from the first word in that it's really an action. Whenever you see it being used, it is connected with actions. And so you'll see these words put together very often, compassionate and gracious, but the gracious part is describing the action that God is going to take because He is compassionate. And so if you look at Exodus chapter 22, God is outlining certain laws that He's giving to the children of Israel. He says, if you take your neighbor's cloak as a pledge, return it by sunset, because that cloak is the only covering your neighbor has. What else can they sleep in? When they cry out to me, I will hear, for I am compassionate. That's the word hanun. In other words, what is God saying here? He's saying, listen, this is not a rich economy. A lot of you only have one cloak. If you take someone's cloak as a pledge during the day, you better give it back to them by nighttime, because when they go to sleep and the temperature drops in the desert, they need that coat or they're going to be cold. If you don't give it back to them, I'm watching. And you better remember, I am compassionate. Now, when Yahweh says this word, compassionate, again, like I said, this is the second word. But they're so close in meaning that it actually gets translated compassionate in the NIV. If you look in the NASB, which is a more accurate word-for-word translation, you will see that the word gets rendered gracious. So this is what Yahweh is saying. He's saying, out of grace, I'm going to act. I'm compassionate, and because of that, because I'm compassionate and gracious, my graciousness means I'm going to do something about this. I don't just feel stuff, I feel stuff and then I do something about it. This is the combination of these words. In 2 Kings, the word is used of Yahweh when He saves Israel from annihilation from a foreign army. He's gracious. He steps in. He does something about it. In Psalm chapter 86, look at this. It says, but you, Lord, are a compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness. Little asterisk. Where did he take this from, the psalmist? Exodus 34, most quoted passage in the Bible by the Bible. He says, turn to me and have mercy on me. Show your strength in behalf of your servant. Save me because I serve you just as my mother did. He says, I know that you're a compassionate and gracious God. And then he uses that second term, have mercy on me. You see, God acts. He feels the compassion, but then he does something about it. Israel is calling upon God to have mercy, to save them out of danger. And so again, we see this is an action word. It is a response word, and we've learned that God is responsive. He's not just a math formula. He's a person, personable. So let's recap here. Rahum is a feeling word. Hanun is an action word. So I want you to remember that when you come before God, you are actually approaching a God who feels everything that you feel and who also is ready to act on those feelings. Let me ask you this. Do you come to God with that perspective? That God really feels, He really has compassion. He really understands what you're going through as much as a mother has those wombly connections with you. He really feels that, and He's willing to act on it. Do you see God in that way? You know, there are three basic ways that people come before God. I want to share those with you real quickly. The first way that people come before God is based on what they've done, right? I come before God and say, God, I want you to think about all of the things that I've done for you, right? I've done this. I have been this. And so based on these things, God, I'm asking you for this. How many of you pray that way? None of you are going to admit that. I understand. But yeah, we do this, don't we? We do it based on what we've done. God, I've been the good guy. Come on. Hear my prayer. You know, it's funny, the only people in the Bible who never seem to get God's mercy is those who think they deserve it. So you might want to think twice about that perspective, that approach. The second way that people come before God is based on what has been done to us. Maybe this is the way you come before God. God, look at the way that I've been treated. Look at my past. Look at the hand that I've been dealt in life. You and I both know this is not fair, right? It's kind of the victim mentality. And there is a time and a place to lament, for sure. But this is not the best approach either, guys. God doesn't want you going around as a victim. There's a third approach, and it's the best approach, and that is that we approach God based on who God is. It's based on His mercy. It's not about you. It's based on who He is and who He has claimed to be. So your prayer should be more like this. God, you are compassionate. You care about me. And I know that you're gracious, that you help. God, you don't owe me anything, and there are many people who have it worse off than I do. But based on the fact that you have said that you are compassionate and gracious, I ask you for this. Now again, that can become a little bit of a formula itself. We're not teaching you formulas in prayer here, but we're trying to show you the heart attitude is different. It's based upon who God is, not on who you are. It's okay to remind God of His character. Let's go to the second section here. Each week we're talking about the Hebrew, now we're talking about some stories. You know, there are a lot of violent stories in the Bible. I don't know if you've noticed. And it becomes the source of mockery for a lot of people. A lot of atheists, a lot of university professors love to go on about some of the violent stories in the Old Testament. You know, what a lot of people fail to consider, there are a couple of things. First of all, is that the Bible is actually recounting history as it happened. So if it was really ugly and really violent, it's just being honest to what was going on at that time in the world. And if you go back and you study history from any other book, you're going to find out the same thing. It was crazy violent. Secondly, what they fail to notice a lot of times is that the ancient world was just a cruel and barbaric place, right? So they fail to see that, you know, the Bible's just telling stories as it happened and that the world was a very cruel and barbaric place. There's a reason why God sometimes acted in violence. And if you actually look at the stories open-minded, you understand the character of God and what was going on in those situations, you can make sense of those stories. But what most people fail to talk about, as they're talking about all the stories of violence in the Bible, is they fail to talk about all the stories of mercy. All of the times when God is merciful and gracious, when He did not need to be. There are way more stories of those. Take the story of Jonah, for example. Jonah was told by Yahweh to go to Nineveh, a great city of that day, and to call them to repent. Nineveh was a great but very, very wicked city. It was a longtime enemy of the nation of Israel. It was the capital of the great Assyrian Empire. And, century after century, they would go in and demolish Israel and just wipe them out. They were brutally cruel. A few decades ago, archaeologists actually unearthed a Ninevite library. And it was pretty interesting. As they checked it out, they discovered some things about that culture and just how cruel the kings of Nineveh were and of the Assyrian Empire. Speaking of a city he had just destroyed, King Shalmaneser II had this to say, quote, "A pyramid of heads I reared in front of his city. Their youths and their maidens I burnt up in the flames." He would literally pile big pyramids of skulls of the men that he defeated, and then he would burn the women and children. His son Sennacherib had this to say about a king he defeated, "I flayed him. His skin I spread upon the wall of the city." If you go back and you study this out, you find out that was most likely alive that he did that. Peeled all the skin off and spread it out over the wall. One of Sennacherib's descendants, King Ashurbanipal, was true to this family name. Writing about another king and another war, he said, "I pierced his chin with my keen hand dagger. Through his jaw I passed a rope, put a dog chain upon him, and made him occupy a kennel." So these are the kinds of people that we're talking about. Jonah was sent to preach a message of repentance to these people, very wicked, evil, violent people who had been menacing the nation of Israel, his nation, for centuries. And honestly, Jonah really wasn't up to the task. So what does he do? He heads in the opposite direction. Instead of going to Nineveh, which is kind of northeast, he heads to Tarshish, which was the furthest outpost of the known world at that time. It's somewhere in Spain. So he heads off to the coast to get on a ship to head as far away from Nineveh as he can. Now, we know the story. We know that after being turned around by God with the help of a great fish, he eventually repents and he goes and he does the job that God asks him to do. And he preaches the word of the Lord in Nineveh. And here's the thing, crazy stuff happens. These wicked, violent people, starting with the king himself, repent. The king literally puts on sackcloth and ashes, and all of the people repent. And it actually says in Jonah 3:10 that God relents from the destruction that he was going to bring upon the city of Nineveh. He was ready to destroy it, and instead he relents. In other words, he changes his mind. Guys, once again, we see this vision that we have of God that he's already made up his mind on everything is not what the Bible describes. It shows here that he actually had a plan, and then he changes the plan based upon what takes place and the change of heart that people have. Jonah's reaction was kind of surprising, given this amazing miracle that just took place. He actually gets very, very angry. He did not like these people. He knew what they had been doing. He knew the kind of people that they were. He didn't want them to repent. He did not want them to become the objects of God's grace and compassion. And he tells Yahweh as much. In Jonah chapter 4, he prayed to the Lord, "Isn't this what I said, Lord, when I was still at home? That is what I tried to forestall by fleeing to Tarshish. I knew that you are a gracious and compassionate God, slow to anger and abounding in love." Where does that come from? What is he quoting? Exodus 34. "A God who relents from sending calamity. Now, Lord, take away my life, for it's better for me to die than to live." He was so angry that God would show compassion on these people. Again, he quotes from Exodus 34 when he's describing God's character. Everybody went back to that passage. This was how Yahweh had revealed himself. Now, why is Jonah so angry? Well, because of God's compassion. Now, listen, guys. We all love God's compassion and grace when it is toward us. Let's put that up there. We all love God's compassion and grace when it's toward us. Isn't this true? We love God's compassion and grace when he's giving it to us. That changes so with other people, doesn't it? How do you do when God is compassionate and gracious toward your enemies? To the people who hurt you, to the people who gossip behind your back. How do you do then? You really asking God to give them grace and compassion? When people lie about you to the boss, how do you do with that? When people betray you, when they divorce you, when they abandon you, then how do you feel about God's grace and compassion that he seems to just give to everybody so liberally? You see, God is compassionate and he is gracious to everyone. Now here's a fact, write this one down. Most of us want mercy for ourselves and justice for everybody else. If you don't get anything today, write that one down because that's priceless. This is what we want. We want mercy for ourselves and justice for everybody else. You know, I can tell you, I've been deeply hurt many times in my life as a pastor. Sometimes intentionally, often not intentionally. But I've had friends steal from me. I've had people that I called friends lie to me. I've had people that I thought were locked arm in arm with me abandon me. And every once in a while, as is wont to happen in our smaller and smaller world, I bump into them. I meet them somewhere, right? For those that hurt me innocently, I'm able to look beyond it. It's like, I don't hold on to that. For those that knew better, I got to tell you, sometimes it's tough. But I forgive. You know what's really difficult? Here's what's really difficult. Maybe you've had this experience. What's really difficult is when you see those people and you know that they did something clearly wrong to hurt you or other people that you love. And what's really hard is when everything's going well for them. That's hard. Everything's going great. It's like they're thriving. And you kind of come back to God and you say, God, you know what they did. You know what happened there. I don't need to remind you of this. And yet, God, you seem to be being gracious and compassionate to them of all people. Well, that brings us to the third section, and that is Jesus. We need to talk about Jesus when we get to this kind of a position. It's really Jesus who helps us through those times. Remember, Jesus personified the attitude of Yahweh. This gracious and compassionate one was put into human flesh in Jesus so that we could see him and see how he acted. And we see the immensity of God's compassion and grace when he teaches us to love our enemies, to do good for those who hate us, and to pray for those who persecute us. See, that's Jesus in human form, but that's Yahweh in human form, right? That's Yahweh. In Matthew chapter 20, he tells the parable of the workers in a vineyard. And the story is basically about all these guys that arrive at different points in the day, and then when it comes pay time at the end of the day, the owner of the vineyard pays them all the same. You're like, dude, you can't do that. And he's like, dude, it's my money. I can do what I want with it. He's gracious and he's compassionate, and sometimes it blows our minds. It doesn't seem just, and I can tell you guys, it's not. It's way beyond just. I'm reminded that God reserves the right to be compassionate with whomever he wills. In Matthew chapter 5, it says that he causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. And so, guys, it's in Jesus' teaching that I recognize just how powerful this compassion concept is. This wombly compassion that we first saw in Yahweh that now lives in Jesus and is supposed to live in us. How powerful this is. When you consider the stories in the Gospels, look at the people who received healing from Jesus. In Luke chapter 17, 10 lepers come to him. They say, Master, have mercy on us. In Luke 18, a blind beggar comes, says, Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me. In Matthew 17, a boy who's being possessed by a demon, his father comes and says, Lord, have mercy on my son. And they're begging him for mercy. And Yahweh, in human form, whose name is Jesus, looked at them, and because of his wombly compassion, he could do nothing else but then to give them what they asked for, to heal them. Now listen, guys, sometimes we get this idea that Jesus was just a super lovey, chill guy that was sort of like the early edition of Mr. Rogers, right? Never knew when to put his shoes on. And he's just nice to everybody. But I need you to know that's not the Jesus that we see in the New Testament. He actually got very angry. He called people out. He took action. But he could not deny his own character in these situations. The story of the prodigal son is another one that just demonstrates the compassion of God. And we study it so many ways from so many different angles. We look at the rebellion of the younger son, who basically, in asking for his inheritance, is treating his father like he's as good as dead. It's so disrespectful. We talk about the older brother who had this self-righteous attitude, thought he was better than everyone else. But often, guys, we forget to talk about the father in the story. The main character of the story is the father, who was intended to be a picture of Yahweh, undoubtedly. Remember, this is Jesus' view of the Father. This is Jesus' view of God that he's sharing. He describes him as a merciful parent who felt deeply for his kids. He describes him as this man who, when he sees his wayward embarrassment of a son, cannot stop himself from running down the driveway and throwing his arms around him. He can't wait a single minute to give him a hug. He cannot wait to throw him a party and to celebrate. This is the kind of compassion that we're seeing. And that brings us to the last section of our message, which is us. What are the implications for us of a God who is truly compassionate and gracious? As we started this series by talking about the fact that what we think about God changes everything. It's the most important thing. Remember A.W. Tozer said, what you think about God is the most important thing in your life. Many of us have grown up with a grossly distorted view of God. It's funny because people even use the Hebrew Scriptures, the Old Testament, to paint this really angry, nasty view of God, when the fact is we're looking at the same Old Testament and we're showing you this is the version of God that we should be understanding. The common idea that's peddled out there is so far from the truth. You need to grasp the compassion of God. And I want to speak to two groups this morning. First of all, as we close, I want to talk to those who should be acting more like their Father. Some of you know of the compassion of God. You've studied the Bible. You know his goodness. You've experienced it. And you call God your Father, but you're not really imitating him. Jesus told us to love our enemies, quote, Matthew 5, so that you may be children of your Father in heaven. To be a child in Hebrew thinking was to be one after the kind of someone. It was to imitate them. It was to be a continuation of them. In Luke 6:36, Jesus said, be merciful just as your Father is merciful. And some of us claim to be God's children, but we don't really act like it when it comes to compassion. So I want to issue you a challenge this morning. I want you to identify, first of all, if you're taking notes, write this down. Who are my enemies? Who do you consider to be your enemies? What would it take for you to show mercy to them? This week, what would it take for you to show mercy, even love to them? What would it take? Have you forgiven them? Do you pray for them like Jesus taught us to do? Another question, who are the people that you have daily opportunity to show mercy to? We need to start with those that are closest to us. Our coworkers, our classmates, our family, our spouse, our kids. Start with the people closest to you. Often the people that annoy you the most, right? Those are the ones that are giving you an opportunity to shine as children of God, to give compassion and grace where it's not deserved. So I want to challenge those of you that consider yourselves children of God, act like it this week. The second group I want to address is those who haven't yet grasped the vision of a compassionate God. Like I said earlier, I know some of you are coming at this with a great disadvantage. The greatest way that God's given for us to understand the unconditional love of a parent is to give us physical parents. And if you haven't had that, how are you ever going to understand the great compassion of the Creator God toward you? But I want to ask you, will you consider what we've been studying, and will you reconsider what you've learned to date about God? Can you gain a new vision of a loving Father? So I want to give you this challenge. If that's your state, I want you to pray this week. I want you to actually try talking to God. And I want you to ask Him to show you this new vision. Use His name. Pray, Yahweh, give me a new vision of you. Read this book. Read this book, right? Read the prodigal son story. Get a new vision for who God is. Tell God that you want to start a whole new thing with Him. Ask for mercy in the places where you need it. Ask for grace in the places where you need it. According to what I'm reading and the true character of who God is by the name that He revealed, He's going to do something about your prayer.